Today's topic, inflation. I think most of us have a basic idea of what inflation is. It's when your money doesn't buy as much as it used to. Economists would call this an erosion of purchasing power. In my first lesson, I talked about how congressional budget deficits contribute to the national debt. And in the second lesson, I explained the Federal Reserve manages that debt, and in the process of managing it, has three very effective tools to fight inflation. But what causes inflation in the first place? The first cause of inflation is perhaps the easiest to understand. It's called cost-push inflation. When costs of some materials, goods, or services increase, it can impact the prices of related goods. Say if you're an orange juice company, and there was a bad crop of oranges produced this season. Because of the reduced supply, you're going to have to pay more for oranges, and in turn, to cover that increased expense, you'll have to raise the price you charge for your orange juice. Now say you run a cafeteria and you include orange juice with your set lunch. You'll have to either raise the price of your lunch offering, or you could switch to another cheaper beverage and maintain your price level. So you can see that while a bad orange crop can push costs up in some segments of the market, having alternatives can diffuse the impact. Now let's add another factor to the mix. Say if you're an apartment renter and your landlord's insurance costs went up. Maybe there was a new law or regulation that insurance companies have to comply with that made their cost of doing business greater. The insurance companies will raise their insurance premiums to cover their losses. The landlord will most likely be inclined to raise the rent to cover his higher costs. So now you're paying more for orange juice, your lunch, and rent. Now, these two cost-push events might not make a serious spike in overall inflation, but you do feel the impact. Now let's add a few things to the mix that will impact overall inflation. Let's say crude oil prices went up. We all know what happens then. We pay more at the pump. All the goods you buy that are transported by truck will see an increase in price too. Now your wallet is really starting to hurt. Your dollar is buying less and less. But your landlord doesn't do a lot of driving, so it's not going to affect your rent. What else can we add to the mix that would have an impact on almost all goods and services you buy, including your rent? Let's say there's a tax increase on corporations, business owners, and wealthy people. A corporation could just hand over the extra taxes. But a corporation is really just a bunch of shareholders, and the shareholders would demand that those losses be made up. Part of the solution would be to raise prices. Since almost all goods and services we buy are provided by corporations, with these new tax increases, the cost of those goods and services will rise, and the dollars we have saved will buy a lot less. What about our rent? Well, our landlord's a rich guy, and his taxes went up, so once again, he's going to have to raise the rent to cover his losses. This phenomenon is called pass-through taxation, and the average American actually pays all taxes, either directly or indirectly. I'll get into more detail on this with my lesson on taxes. But I had to mention it because tax increases are one of the biggest contributors to cost-push inflation, and it was important to briefly cover it here. I'm also going to have a separate lesson on unemployment. However, I also need to note here, another short-term impact of cost-push inflation is increased unemployment. Not only will corporations try to make up their losses by raising prices, they'll also try to cut costs, and sadly one of the easiest way to cut costs are layoffs and pay cuts. A quick recap. Cost-push inflation means when rising costs and expenses push up prices of related goods. Contributing factors can be short supplies, the oranges and oil are an example, increased costs of business, for example, the legislation, regulation, or new taxes. Demand pull is the next factor that can lead to inflation. Right now, there isn't a great demand for prune juice. It's a fairly cheap beverage at the grocery store. But what if it was discovered that drinking 1 gallon of prune juice a day would reverse the aging process and you would lose all your excess body fat? Wow! there would be a huge demand for prune juice, and the price of prune juice would skyrocket. Juice sellers could charge just about anything they wanted to for it. That is demand pull, when an increase in demand pulls up prices. A more realistic example of this is flaxseed. Flaxseed was a very cheap commodity, and it was used in paper processing, dyes, soaps, etc. You could buy a drum of it for pennies. Once it was discovered that it's rich in omega-3 fatty acids that promote good cholesterol, the demand for flaxseed increased and prices went up exponentially. Unlike cost-push inflation, demand-pull inflation has a positive effect on employment. The prune juice producers and the supplement companies that sell flaxseed will have to hire more people so they can increase production to meet growing demand. In the 90s, during the dot-com explosion, there was a rapidly growing demand for people with computer savvy, and salaries for people with these skills grew rapidly. So now we know different types of inflation have different effects on wages and unemployment, but keep in mind these are all short-term effects. The next cause of inflation is easy to understand but often overlooked, and that's called expectations. Expectations play a major role in nearly every area of economics, and inflation is no exception. Let me give you an example of what an expectation is. Let's say you want to buy a big screen TV. Over the last few years, you have noticed the price of big screen TVs drop. And I think most of us expect them to keep dropping. And TVs keep getting bigger and bigger, and prices get cheaper and cheaper. It's safe to say none of us feel any rush or pressure to go out and buy that big screen TV immediately. That feeling is based on expectations. Expectations can actually cause inflation as well. If there are no factors in the free market contributing to inflation, if all economic conditions were stable, but the general population, for whatever reason, expected inflation was on the way, those expectations alone would change behavior and actually cause inflation. Let me give you an extreme example just to illustrate the point. Say if you were living in a period without any inflationary forces, and that you had a chat with your neighbor, and he said, "Hey, you better start stocking up, inflation is on the way." You might shrug your shoulders and ignore him. But then you run into an old economics professor of yours from college, and he tells you the same thing. Then your boss at work tells you inflation is on the way and the company needs to stock up on key inventory items. Then you turn on the news and they start talking about inflation. And then that news report gets interrupted by the president, and he says inflation is coming fast and there's no way to avoid it. Now keep in mind, all these people in this scenario are lying. There is nothing in the economy to indicate inflation should come. But you don't know that. And you'll be firmly convinced prices are going to skyrocket soon. So you and everyone else will want to stock up. You're going to make all those major purchases you've been putting off. You're going to stock up on key items. In turn, that's going to raise overall demand, and prices will indeed start to rise. And even those who didn't believe all the rumors, because there were no inflationary pressures in the economy, once they see prices really start to rise, they will stock up too, further exacerbating the problem. Once people start stocking up or hoarding, it raises the overall level of demand, and prices will indeed rise and create inflation. Just as a side note, economists call this demand aggregate demand. Now my example is extreme, but it does happen all the time. The president or the chairman of the Fed or some other well-respected, well-informed figure will make a slip and say something that might indicate inflation is on the way. And the media picks up on it and plays the soundbite over and over and over. And many people will change their purchasing behaviors, and through those expectations, actually create an inflationary situation. So back to that big screen TV. If you are convinced the price were going to double next month, You might do whatever it took to buy that TV this month. And if the general population had the same expectations as you, the price of TVs would indeed start to rise rapidly.